Hi, and welcome to Together, the podcast where we dive into conscious partnership, parenting, and explore the relational space between you, me, which creates the we. And before we dive into today's episode, we want to just name that we are about to launch our first online community. So if you are loving these episodes, you're finding so much value, and you want to be in a communal relational space with other conscious couples doing this work, wanting to deepen in love, well, we have just the thing for you. We're going to be opening the doors on November 8th. And we're going to put down in the show notes, there's going to be a link to go join that wait list. And it's going to be full of all kinds of
conscious, loving couples.
Yeah. And group calls. If you click on the link, it'll give you all the details of what's inside. And also, we just want to give a quick shout out to Mindful Meds, our sponsor. So grateful for their products. Really helps the reweaving of neural pathways. And it's a medicinal mushroom company. And so if you go to mindfulmeds.io, there's going to be a link down in the show notes. Because you're valuable listeners, you're going to get 15% off. All you have to do, go put in the promo code Together.
And mushrooms are they're connectors. That's what they do. They work in the mycelium of the planet, and they heal. And so bringing in plant allies who do that within the earth, bringing that into our body, it reconnects us on the physical level and brings in that wisdom of the plants. And so on the relational journey, having mushroom support can be huge for helping you adapt, form new neural pathways, feel connected to the earth. And it can be really powerful to build a relationship with the plant spirit. Hi, and welcome to today's Together podcast episode. It's our first solo podcast episode that I'm going to do on my own on preconception and conception, conscious preconception and conception, and how they shape our relationships in our life throughout our life. And this is a topic I'm so excited by. I'm inspired by. I actually ran into a fan of the podcast who was saying how interested they are in that topic. And it just made me feel so lit up to just do a deep dive into it with you all. And what I want to say is, whether you plan to have children at some point, whether you already have children, or even if you're never planning on having children, this is very relevant, because how we are conceived, what the preconception time looks like, it shapes our life. It shapes our relational life in a huge way. It shows up in our experiences of relationship as adults, and also in our experience of how we create, how we bring our purpose into the world. And the part that I feel the most excited about is, if you aren't a parent yet, you can bring a huge amount of consciousness to the lead up to conceiving and to the experience of conceiving that drastically will impact how your child experiences themselves, how they experience relationship, and how they can manifest their essence into the world in a more grounded, whole way. When we can get really conscious about how we hold that space, that transitioning into life space. And then for those of you that have children, what's so magical about this is when we become aware of the imprints that our children are carrying that are from that preconception conception time. It's amazing for me to watch so many mamas and papas have huge insights about behaviors, experiences, challenges that are happening for their children now that they can now trace back to, oh, that's what was happening at that time, right? And when we become aware of it, we can hold what's happening for our children now in a new way with a new consciousness. And just that can shift a huge amount for our children. And it can also give us insight about how to unwind it. So as you're listening, if you have feelings come up about that time, that preconception, conception time for your children or your child, know that you feeling your feelings and processing authentically what's coming up for you helps clear the field. I just had a mama that I've been talking with who was at the New Human event, and we there were talking about the womb time. I dove into that and the impact of that. And she had a whole bunch of insights about her daughter and what's been happening for her daughter that are from that time. And just her feeling her feelings, moving the energy through her body as a mama, when she got home, her daughter had shifted a lot. And she's been amazed at how much has shifted. So, even when I work with parents now who are unwinding the field of trauma that their child is carrying from conception, preconception, time in the womb, birth, so much can move without ever actually working with the child directly. Just the parents working with the field does a lot of the work. And then sometimes there are some ways that children need to be met in their actual nervous system, but this information is going to empower you to make sense, of your own journey and your child's journey. And hopefully for those of you that haven't had children yet and want to, that this is really going to inspire you even more into showing up for that process in a conscious way. And what I want to start off saying is we definitely live in a society that has a strong idea. Like I knew I wanted to be a mom for a long time. I knew that I was consciously wanting to move towards conception. And I can't tell you how often even that idea that I would be so conscious about the preconception time, I would encounter all kinds of ideas like, well, it'll just happen when it's meant to happen. You have to just not be so worried about it and just let it happen how it's going to. Most children are born by accident anyways. You can't control everything. These were some of the things that I was told, you'll never be ready, just do it. And I'm not saying there's not like little nuggets of gold in all of those statements that are coming from people's lived experience, but I can speak from my lived experience and also from my experience as a somatic practitioner who works with people to unwind these pieces is there is nothing controlling or shameful about wanting to be really conscious about how we call children in. This is something that has existed around the planet in so many ways, in so many cultures, was a real consciousness around how we call souls in. And we now live in a culture that has forgotten a lot of that. And I think a lot of that stems from loss of ritual and tradition, because traditionally there would have been ritual and ways that we would have been met by initiations and ritual to guide us into that time of our life where we're calling in children. And the other thing is the loss of wise women, right? As women, we would have had elder women who would have been initiating us into that time, initiating us into that wisdom. And I'm not saying that in the past it was all idyllic. How I think of this is there's this ancient wisdom that exists in indigenous cultures, that has existed in ancient times. There have been priestesses and beautiful beings that have walked the planet and birthed children in beautifully intentional ways. And there's also been a lot of unconsciousness ancestrally too. And so I often think of this as it's landing back in, linking back into the health that lives in the ancient wisdom and the indigenous wisdom, as well as bringing in the new consciousness that is informed by us living a more abundant life, many of us, living a more safe life, and also informed by science, by the nervous system. And that's my jam. I love merging, the mystical and the science together. So I'm going to share with you how I see preconception and conception. It's going to be made up of, my educational learning and also my personal experience, and also what I have experienced in supporting people in connecting this time in with their own healing. And, for me, I really feel like the New Earth way of conception is actually for women to start to consciously, and I would say this is the beginning of where conscious parenting can begin, ideally can begin, is when women actually start to prepare themselves for motherhood years before. And by this, I don't mean like rigorous, but I mean really becoming intentional well before wanting to become a mom, maybe even before you've met the partner, even before you're living the life that you're going to be living, but really starting to, if you want to become a mom at some point, instead of being like, oh, that'll happen one day and just pushing it away in your consciousness, actually thinking of, years before that the steps you're taking are steps towards the life that would create the scenario for a child to come in a good way. And for me, how I see this is if we can bring consciousness to it, we can actually start communing with the soul of our child or the souls of our child well before we actually conceive. And I know for me, it's interesting because there were several years where I wasn't super conscious that this is what I was doing, even though what I would say is that my biology was doing it. And what I was doing is I was actually deeply healing my nervous system. And at this time on the planet, I would say that as women, we have a lot of nervous system healing that we can do before becoming mothers that will support us getting pregnant, being able to carry life, and also showing up for parenting in a much more regulated, grounded, resourced way. And so for me, it began with that, in my mid-20s, really deeply diving into somatic healing to heal my nervous system. And, it's interesting right now on the planet that there's a huge increase in infertility. So many women aren't able to birth at home, and there's no shame about that, but that's interesting. Like what the percentages of women that end up needing assistance, medical assistance, is huge. The amount of complications that are happening is so much higher. And of course, I'm so grateful that the medical system is there to catch women in these experiences. But what I'm also curious about is the unwinding of what's happening here. And from my lens, this really stems back to our nervous systems. Because if we already are jam-packed with trauma in our nervous systems from our childhood, patriarchy, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, mistreatment of our sexuality as women, all of this deeply shapes what we're carrying in our nervous systems and in our wombs. If I rewind back at that time when I started doing nervous system work, I was the classic, really anxious person, had anxiety since I was a child, panic attacks, this kinds of things. And in my late teens, early 20s, I was diagnosed with polycystic ovary syndrome. So my moon time wasn't regular. I would have really intense bleeding and then no bleeding and then moon several times a month. I had a lot of pain when I was having sex. I ended up getting a laparoscopy because of the pain, and they determined that I had some endometriosis. So, my hormones were all over the place when I had my moon. If I would have gotten pregnant at that time, my journey of motherhood would have been so, I'm going to swear, fucking different than what I've experienced. I would have been very dysregulated. I believe I would have had a hard time getting pregnant. I likely would have been told that I had infertility issues. And I had generationally been connected with this kind of pattern because my mom had several miscarriages before having me. She had endometriosis. And then she had a miscarriage after me. And she had been told that maybe she couldn't have children. She ended up having 3. And so, at that time, I really I went into the medical system for help, right? Ended up getting a little surgery, And for me, the game changer was when I actually went in an IUD. Not that I'm not recommending this, but this helped me a lot. I went in an IUD for 6 years. And during that time, I deeply did nervous system work. And, what I ended up discovering was so much of what I was carrying in my womb, so much of what I was carrying in my nervous system that was creating all these symptoms really was sexual trauma from an abusive relationship, a sexually abusive relationship that I was in as a teenager, was huge. Had impacted me a lot. There was also some sexual harassment energy I'd been really exposed to as a child that was really inappropriate. It had affected me in a huge way. And then also my womb was carrying the story of my mother, and her losses and the pain and the griefs that she hadn't fully felt, the pain and the loss of those children in her womb. And then even further up, I became aware of that I was carrying a lot of trauma from my great-grandmother who had had actual children die. And so there were all these layers that my body was carrying, and it was deeply impacting my cycle. It was deeply impacting my hormones. And it's so interesting because really when all I did was work on regulating my nervous system, getting somatic support, by the time I went off of the IUD, and by that time I had done a lot of this work, I was also working in shamanism and, going into my womb and speaking to my womb and energetically clearing my womb. By the time I went off my IUD, my cycle was regular. It was really mild. It was not destabilizing emotionally. It was a whole new body. I was fertile. I had come into a fertility. And it's really interesting because I didn't do any medical things. I wasn't on any medications. I wasn't actually, my way was, and I know for some of you out there, this is a way. I wasn't even taking any herbs or anything like that. It was all physical and emotional work, and it completely rewrote my nervous system. And what I want to say is to all of you is when our nervous system is dysregulated, it's in a state of survival. And so it doesn't put energy towards things like fertility. It's not going to put energy into deeply making us have a healthy reproductive system, because those are the kinds of things that the nervous system does when a woman is safe, when a woman has enough safety to be able to call in life. What the nervous system thinks is happening when we're in survival and dysregulation is we're running for our life. We're so unsafe. We're running from the tiger. We're, running from the flood. And of course, the body is not going to want to make a baby when we're in that level of distress and unsafety. There's wisdom to that. The problem is that so many women nowadays, and I was one of them, are walking around with so much dysregulation that is spanning over years and years of their life, that the body is in that state in an ongoing way. And it's not able to deeply come into reproductive health and reproductive goodness because we're not regulating. We don't have that healthy dorsal deep rest. And I don't know if any of you know this, but there's a part of our nervous system which is rest and digest. It's when we go into a deep dorsal rest. And we can only go into dorsal rest, and dorsal is the part of our nervous system that's the parasympathetic. It's the calm, the deep calm. And there's a state in our dorsal, because there's a spectrum our dorsal can go into, which is deep rest and digest. When we're in that place, it means we're so safe that the animal in us can completely let go. And it's only in that state that our body goes in and cleans our body, goes in and deeply nourishes our digestive system. It's the only time that our body can really go in and do its deeper work, where it's not just trying to run the machine of our body, but it's actually deeply cleansing and nurturing our body and building cells and restructuring things. So if we aren't going into that state, we aren't actually able to heal in a deep way. We're just in maintenance. And if the maintenance level of our nervous system is just, a baseline functioning of survival, then what's happening is, that reproductive health, our digestive health, all these places aren't able to renew themselves. They're not able to come more into a fertility, And so if any of you out there that are listening that have these kinds of things happening for you, I really encourage you to get curious about the fact that in our healthy blueprint, we are fertile. We are meant to be fertile. The actual, percentage of women that would have actual fertility issues themselves that are directly related to how your womb was developed or these kinds of things is a small percentage compared to the amount of women that are having trouble having healthy cycles and having, healthy pregnancies and getting pregnant. And it's because so many women are dysregulated. And so the groundbreaking opportunity we have as conscious women is to do the nervous system work before we conceive. Do you need to have healed all of it? No. But I would say there is a general baseline of regulation and safety we can reach in our nervous systems that will mean that when we conceive, our body is able to do it more in touch with its physiological health and capacity. And it means that your child will develop in a much more regulated and safe nervous system and space. And the reality is that we can do the nervous system work once we are pregnant, once we have children, but it's a lot harder. And for so many women, the initiation that they have into doing that deeper healing or even realizing that they have this deeper nervous system healing work to do is becoming moms. Like it's not till they become moms. It's not till they're pregnant and all of a sudden they're having so much difficulty in the pregnancy and so many complications. And then, they have their baby and now, the behavioral stuff that comes out in the children. It's not until they're in that initiation that they start to realize, oh my gosh, I'm actually carrying a lot. I'm actually dysregulated. And then that initiates them. And that's great. Like the fact that motherhood can initiate that is amazing. And what I want, a mission I'm on is to spread the word to women. What if we can become aware of this sooner and do it before we become moms? Because then it's much less of a stressful gauntlet. We can be way more resourced and present in the process. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I got to experience as a mom because of the work that I had done. So the first piece about preconception is what level of safety and resource are we able to create in ourselves so that we're embodying fertility and abundance well before we conceive? Because we're basically creating the field of energy within which we're calling a life in. It's the field of energy that we're saying, come on in. This is life. This is your life. This is what it feels like. This is what's here. And so, for me, and I feel like this is a huge part of conscious parenting, it really was, first of all, that was one of the layers, preparing my body, healing my reproductive system. And then the other thing was years, I think it was 3 or 4 years before conceiving my son, Cedar, I was visited by his soul. And it was on my birthday, and this star came in above my head, downloaded me right through the crown of my head in this moment and showed me all of the lineage, the people in my lineage before me, all of the future generations and where I was in the web and the role that I was going to be playing in the web. And this soul was saying to me, hey, in order for me to come in and to embody myself in the way that I need to, there's certain things that I need you to do, to grow into, to have set up so that I can actually be who I'm meant to be. And I received that. It was profound. And then a friend of mine told me about the book series, Anna, Grandmother of Jesus. If any of you are listening, powerful channeled stories about the women, the mother, the grandmother of Jesus, and what it really speaks to. Yes, it's about the story of Jesus, but really it's more about women living a spiritual life who are in the practice of consciousness around conceiving children and the spiritual practice of what it looks like to be women that are using conception as a way for spiritual evolution and evolving the planet. Super powerful. And this is what my son was inviting me into, And then from that moment on, I was devoted to letting his energy guide me. And how I think of this is not so much he was guiding me, but more I was attuning to his essence and feeling what I needed to do to bring that frequency into my life, to set up my life in the right way. And he was really saying, if you want me to come in this way, this is what has to be there. Now, I could have ignored that. I could have decided, no, whatever, I'm just going to see what happens. What I would argue, there's two things I wonder about. Would I maybe then give birth to a different soul because this soul was saying, this is what I need? It might be then I'd call in a different soul that didn't need those specific criteria. That's my feeling of it. Or perhaps I would have given birth to my son's soul now, and it just wouldn't have been the most ideal criteria. He'd have more material to work through. There'd just be more barriers that he would have to digest to come more into his essence. So I then went on a journey of consciously, where do I need to live? Who do I need to be around? And what I would argue is this is both something to do intentionally, like with our minds, but it's also something that is an energy that our wombs know. So what I would say is our wombs are this powerful energy center that are physiological and they're energetic. So if we just start to embrace ourselves as becoming mother, the womb itself is going to start to work its magic and start to build the field around us that's needed. If we can keep welcoming its wisdom and allowing its energy to fill the space and doing all the things that cultivate the health and fertility for our womb space to be able to work its magic. So by that, I mean eating really good food, drinking good water, getting enough exercise, being outside, just all the things that will tend to that space, listening to the womb. And it will start to, we're built this way. This is how women are built. We're meant to do this. So if we can clear the way in the nervous system and our energetic field, the womb is going to bring in all the pieces that are needed. And so for me, part of that looked like where I ended up living. And it's so funny. I've ended up living in a valley, and then here my son was born. And I don't know if there's any of you that are nerds on human design, but where he is most ideal to live is in a valley. Well, that's really interesting. I ended up living in a valley in a cabin. One of the most profound things that came into my life before becoming a mother, which again, I would say this is part of conscious preconception. In order to bring in life in a grounded way, and this would have been something that women would have known before when we had elders, etc., we need to have a sisterhood around us, because conceiving and being pregnant, giving birth is a huge surrender, a huge opening. We aren't able to show up in the same productivity in the way that we normally are, and we actually have to deeply sink in, deeply rest in, deeply let go. In order to do that in a good way, we need to be surrounded by women who can actually hold us in that, can honor us in us in that, and also mirror back the journey of motherhood. So, historically, there would have been a wisdom like gather with the women. And I don't know how many women I have met, again, that it's not until they have children that all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, I'm so alone. I don't have any women around me that have children, or I have some women around me that have children, but they're not resonant people, or they don't want to raise their children in the same way. This is a very common thing. And again, no shame, because of course, this is what's happening. And we need to start to get more conscious about, how do I build the field of support around me beforehand and get my womb to do that, ask my womb to do that, ask the soul of my child to do that, call in Mother Mary, call in the guides to help do that. Mary Magdalene, Anna, grandmother of Jesus, call these guides in. How do I start to build this field? For me, what was really magical is I ended up, and it was so aligned, being called into a group of women who lived in the valley. And almost every woman in the group, there's about 13 women, were mothers, but they were all mothers that had children under 5, One woman had a couple children that were a little bit older, but they were all women that were really they were in the fertility time. So, when I joined the circle, there were 2 women that were pregnant, there were many babies, and they were in that window. And I got to journey with those women every new moon for 3 years before I gave birth to my son. And so for 2 years before getting pregnant. And I can't tell you how much that prepared me to be a mother. And of course, it was all nonverbal. I remember the feeling like when I would sit with these sisters, I was around bodies that were breastfeeding, that were co-sleeping, that were spending all day tending to children. And that were deeply in a fertility. I remember watching my sister, breastfeed and just feeling the abundance of energy coming off her. And we would sing together and journey the moons together. And every new moon we'd gather and we would be deeply in feminine practice. And I felt my body learn from them. I literally felt my whole being recalibrate to fertility. And it was through smells, it was through sounds, it was through just the very frequency of that time of having children under 5. It was like I was in the soup of it. And we all deeply journeyed together for many years. Now, again, if I was in a different zone, I would be like, oh, well, I don't really have a lot in common with these women because I'm not a mother yet. That could have been. And actually, I did encounter a bit being in the group where people are like, well, you're not a mother yet. Only a little bit, only a tiny flavor. Most of them were so like, loving. But there was a bit of that. But I was a mother. I was becoming a mother. And I understood that this was partly how I was going to open into fertility. And I remember my moon got so in sync during that time. Like I got my moon every new moon. My body was so fertile. And I really feel like that's partly why my conception and my pregnancy and my birth went so smooth, is because my body was deeply learning from the women around me. So for women that are listening out there who are either mothers or, want to become mothers, a curiosity. Do you have women around you that are embodying healthy fertility? Do you have women around you that are embodying healthy motherhood that resonates for you? Most of the way that we learn in our bodies, in our physiology, is through modeling, through how people are being. So we need to get ourselves around people that are living and walking what we want to be living and walking. And then our whole beings can become that so much more easily. For those of you who aren't planning on being parents, or even those who are, I also invite you to reflect on, for your mother, before she conceived you, what did her support network look like? What kinds of people did she have around her? What kinds of practices did she have around her? And again, with no judgment, but a curiosity, because that will deeply shape the way that a woman feels supported by village for when she conceives. It will influence how much she can open, how much she can receive the baby, how resourced she feels. And it's just something to be curious about. And how does that show up in your life now? So just to fast forward a little bit, it's interesting because during that time I was deeply journeying with these women, and, we were singing and eating food together. We were cooking. I was learning, what they were feeding their children. And I was walking with women that are living in a very different way from the main matrix, meaning very earth-based. Every woman in that group delivered their babies at home with no complications. Some of them had challenging births, still delivered at home. So also I was around that, and I was getting to see, like, what are they eating? How are they being? How are they embodying in their day-to-day life that allowed them to do that? How are they being with their children? All of these women, dressing their children in natural clothing and spending lots of time outside, eating from their gardens, using story and song, not using television, song and music, and very natural. And that's how I wanted to parent. And so I was being around that. And yeah. And then so much guidance too, right? As I was moving towards that time, so much guidance, so much information. And it's so interesting because if I fast forward now to who Cedar is, I can't tell you how amazed I am constantly at how easy it is for me to call in support around Cedar. It's almost like it shows up before I even have to ask. Like my whole experience has been so much community support. And I really feel like a part of this is because the imprint now in his field, the energetic pattern in his field is when he came in, his mom was already so held and supported that it's kind of just a given in his body, in his nervous system, in his energetic matrix. Of course, I'm going to be held and supported. Of course, there's going to be resource. And what I've noticed is because he has that imprint, it's really easy for support to come in. And I know the opposite. For me, my mom had some support. She had more support than maybe quite a few people, but also a real lack of support too, in terms of like wise women and elders and these kinds of things. She wasn't supported in that way and to the same extent that I have been. And also I would say she had some really beautiful friends that were so helpful. And there was a lack around her of, deeply embodied people that would have known how to hold her in healing, and, or to deepen into her womb in a deeper way, like these kinds of things. And what I would say that created for me is it's been an uphill battle to call in attuned, aligned support. And I have to work really hard in my life to call in enough support, to call in enough resource. It's like, it's like every time I need support, it's like, okay, I need support and I got to work really hard, which was why it was such a miracle to have so much support come in before I gave birth, but also was because I had done so much work on that. I had been so isolated and I really worked on that. And so what I'm saying here is just to help you feel the way that our imprint shapes what happens in our life. And, that played out for Cedar, even with, during my pregnancy, I had lots of support. Postpartum, I had lots of support. Months after, I had lots of support. I have had mamas giving me clothes and we were fed for 2 months after giving birth. And all of that stems from this preconception conception field. That's this initial imprinting that happens. And so for all of us, it's the initial story that happens of, this is the field I'm coming into. And what in that point of conception, and even beforehand, and I'm going to talk about that for a minute, but at that point of conception, what the physiology is doing, what the DNA is doing is it's going, what kind of world am I being born into? And it's reading the field. Am I being born into a field where my mom is held and safe? Is there enough food? Is there joy here? Is there love here? Is it really stressful? Am I alone? Is there isolation? It's feeling into that. And then what's so fascinating is the DNA that decides to turn on or off in the genetics is shaped by what the field holds at that time. So, more healthy aspects of the DNA, healthy aspects of the blueprint, the healthy blueprint can come online, the more that that in that point of conception, that there's resource in the field, the more that there's love and connection. And so, but if we even back up even more, even before the physiology, the egg and the sperm are gathering information. The egg from the mama is gathering information from when she's in her mama's womb. So really the cells that create us as mamas existed when our mom was in our grandmother's womb. And so already we were gathering information. We were gathering information about what kind of world is this? Like, and it shapes us, and when we become conscious of it, we can start to work with it. Now, also beyond just the physiology, there is how I experienced it, how I've read about it, what I've noticed, this is what I believe, is that the soul of the child is hanging out in the field of the mother quite a bit before we give birth too. And I think it depends on the soul. But I also think we can intentionally connect with that child to call them in more, to invite them to be more a part of that process. And lots of traditions talk about this. And I actually felt this in my journey with Cedar, is I felt his soul coming in to calibrate to this life, to get to know what is this world, what's here, who's my mom, and what am I here to learn, well before. And if you think about healthy development is all about titrating. It's about coming in a little bit at a time, experiencing something new a little bit at a time. So if we think of the healthy landing of a soul in a body, it's a huge transition. The more time the soul of that child can have to prepare for the life they're coming into, the easier that integration is going to be, the easier it's going to be to come in. Now, I've worked with people who are adults, and I've also worked with mamas who have given birth to little ones where, because the preconception time wasn't as conscious and planned, it's so fascinating. The imprint of the child becomes, I kind of just show up in things and I don't know how I got there and I don't know what's going on. So this can be an imprint and I think I know from the people I've worked with, and maybe not for everybody, I don't want to project that, but that if we were conceived in a way where there wasn't any pre-planning, there wasn't a lot of and then a child's just conceived and bloop, they're here, that can be disorienting for a soul. It can also be beautiful material for them to learn from and grow in, and it's okay, but it can create an imprint of confusion, disorientation. Where am I? Why am I here? Who am I? And then that will play out. So that can play out where you keep ending up in things and you don't know why you're there. It can play out in everything happens too fast for you and you don't really know what's happening. It can play out that you're conceived in that way, and then in your birth, you're born really fast, or, things happen too quickly for the baby and they're not really able to attune. And so, this is where the more leeway there is before conceiving, the more time there is for the soul to prepare, for the mama's body to prepare, for the papa's body to prepare, so that everything can show up in a more coherent way. And, and then when we come to that conception time, this is what's so interesting. In Ayurveda, they talk about that moment of conception is literally creates the frequency of vitality that carries that child through the rest of their life. There's like a baseline of vitality that happens at that moment that is very hard to rewrite. We can, but it's almost like working against a current. And the more balanced and supported and loved a mama is during that time, the more balanced the child's energy will be. So, in Ayurveda, they talk about the three energies. It's Pitta, Vata, and Kapha. And many of us have more or less of the different energies. But the more balanced the mom is at the time of conception, the more balanced those three energies are going to be in the child. It means that they have more access to all of the energies of life and more vitality. So that moment, it really matters. And the well-being of us in that moment really matters. And, I remember it felt so powerful to do ceremony and ritual before conceiving. And, Mike and I also did herbs. We took herbs for a year. I think for him it was 6 months. For me, it was a year beforehand, taking herbs to cleanse our body and prepare ourselves. And also, for about a year before conceiving, I ate a certain kind of diet. I ate in the way of, this is where we eat more solidifying foods like bone broth and butter, and I would eat more meat. And I was eating things that were more grounding, because one of the things we want to do when we're leading up to conception, when we're breastfeeding, whereas in the rest of the time in our life, we might want to have periods of detoxing and cleansing and a lightness and this kind of thing. When we're starting to move towards conception, we don't want to do that. We actually don't want to be doing any big detoxes or big cleanses in our system quite a bit before we conceive, because we actually want to bring energy in and down. We actually want to build our energy up. We don't want to be cleansing energy. We want to be building it. We want to be building our stamina, bringing energy in. And also one of the things that I did before that, I work in psychedelic therapy. I use different plant medicines and things. And well before conceiving, I stopped. I wasn't using those things. Again, to really prepare my body and to have more cleansing. There was one plant medicine I still used a little bit, only because I was quite familiar with it. And that felt right, like almost like a small dose. And then at a certain point, I stopped doing that too. Because for me, it wasn't about not bringing in the plant spirit. Again, it was about, because it was a purgative and purges and cleanses, and we really want to consolidate and ground the energy. And so all of this leading up to conception. And then for me, right before conception, there was a tuning in. When is the right time energetically? And I am such a geek for this because I just find it so fascinating, the astrological alignments that end up being there that shape our life so big based on when we're conceived and when we're born. And there's so many schools of thought around this. But for me, what I came to land in is that there's a right alignment, or a more right alignment for a soul and the astrology of when they would come in. And that part of the role of the mother is to tune into that, to listen. So, I've seen this be in people's imprinting where, maybe the soul was actually saying, I want to come in at this time or at this time, but the mom almost overrides that. Like, no, I want you sooner. Or I've worked with people where this has been a thing. And then part of their imprinting and their patterning is, I don't get to have my timing. My mom isn't really listening to what I'm saying I need. And it's more, she's directing. And then that becomes an imprint they're working with. And so what I believe is the mom is really the bridge who's listening deeply and attuning deeply to what is it that my child is needing astrologically? What's the alignment? And I'm also curious about where women can get frustrated about, why am I not getting pregnant yet? Blah, 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 blah. Some of that I think is, things happening with fertility. And then some of it I think can also be, it might not be the right alignment yet. And we can get in our heads about that and want to control it because we're used to controlling things. And what happens if we listen? Like, what if this soul needs a certain astrological alignment to be more close to what they're here to learn about? And can we listen and attune and co-create with life in a way that trusts that? And I remember having this feeling like there was a certain alignment. It was like, now, this is the time. It's meant to happen now. And there was almost this like urgency that I had to keep being like, but I feel like it was because of the astrological alignment. And Cedar was saying, it's time now. This is the time. And, I ended up doing some ceremonies with my blood the last moon that I had. And it was really powerful because I was offering the moon blood to my garden and I was singing. And during that, at that same moment, I was doing some kirtan chanting. A mama bear and a baby bear came by. And we actually ended up giving Cedar the middle name Bear because of that, the last moon before I conceived. And then also he was due around the time of Imbolc, which is when bears give birth. So just an interesting thing. But this is where we, meaning and signs. And then that moment of conception is so important, can we, and this is the key, how connected are mama and papa in that moment? And again, let's reflect a little bit because so many people are born unconsciously and that's okay. But what we're shaped by in this place is it that mom wanted a baby and dad didn't really want to, maybe dad really wanted a baby, mom didn't want to, maybe mom and dad were fighting. They were having a rough, month that month. Where are mom and dad at in their clarity about having a baby? And that again is going to shape us. It's going to shape our imprinting and the relational patterns around us. I've had clients who could remember that before they were even conceived, mom and dad were fighting a lot, or, whoa, I feel like right after I was conceived, there was a whole bunch of upset about that, and that totally impacts our life, our journey. And so the most ideal situation, and of course it'll never be perfect. Ours wasn't perfect. We are human. We were having little disagreements and but generally, because we're learning how to have a relationship. But generally for Mike and I, we both knew we wanted to have a baby. And we conceived intentionally. We knew that I was that I was ovulating, and we did it intentionally. One of the little interesting tidbits for you to know, any of you that are leading towards conception, is, and this might even be playing out in your health, is if sometimes there can be this thing where people are like, let's have so much sex during this time. But there's an interesting thing where you don't want to deplete the dad's sperm and the vitality in the dad's sperm, because you want the vitality in the sperm to transfer into that conception moment. So you want to have sex a few times maybe in that window, but not to overdo it, because you don't want to deplete the papa's vitality. Because that will shape, again, the vitality of that imprint right at that moment, of the health of that little one. And again, these are all things that we would have been taught by the elders in our village, and there would have been stories about and rituals. And so this is what we're having to heal around. And so conception. Now, I'd invite you to reflect on, how did you conceive your child? What was happening at the time of conception? It might even be helpful for those of you that have children and you want to reflect on this, is what are the themes of some of the things that were happening in your world at that moment, writing them out, and then just being curious, how are those themes present in your child's life now? And then also doing that for your own conception. And for some of you, you might know about your conception. You might be able to ask your parents about your conception. You might not be able to, and maybe it's more tuning in energetically. What I would really encourage you to get curious about is, for many of us, our families have certain stories that they tell about these times. And often those stories are not whole stories. Often it'll be an aspect of what they remember, and they don't remember the whole story. Often it'll be like a more pleasant rewrite that parents make so that they don't hurt you or make anything uncomfortable, or also so that they don't have to feel uncomfortable. So what I generally say is, really trust what your body feels was true. Really trust, and really also use your adult brain to go back and be like, but realistically, with what was happening in my mom's life at that time, what would have been some of the themes that would have been around her? Where was she living? What kind of support did she have? What were the ideologies around her? And just getting curious. And then again, thinking, how does that show up in my life now? The other really important piece around conception is how we are met in the discovery. So this is huge relationally. How was I received? So first of all, was I wanted? Was I called in consciously? And it's not to say that if I was, I'm more valuable or more important, not at all. But what does happen is, if we are consciously conceived and we're called in and our parents want us and they're saying, we want you, and the way is paved, we will come in with more of a sense of welcome. We will feel welcomed. We'll be like, I was called in, here I am. Oh, and they're happy when the moment they notice that they're pregnant, they're happy. Wow, their celebration, yay. And that'll create this kind of imprint. And it'll land in people as a deep sense of self-confidence and worth. If our parents got pregnant accidentally, maybe they didn't even know we were there for a while, Maybe when they discovered they were pregnant, they were horrified, terrified, scared, disappointed, sad. That will create an inner sense for the child inside of, and this is, of, I'm not welcome here. I wasn't wanted. Oh, there's something wrong with me. Oh, I'm creating so much distress in the field. Whoa, my very existence is making my family so distressed. So these are the kinds of things that they'll feel. This can log in the body as like a deep sense of lack of worth, a deep sense of lack of place, a deep lack of feeling but like a belonging. It's really interesting how often people who had that kind of conception and then the way their parents reacted when they discovered them, it can also really deeply create a feeling of, I don't want to be here. Like, there isn't a place for me here. Am I even here? And, I don't want to be here. It doesn't feel good here. And feelings of suicidality can happen, or there can be a sense that people can have is my soul never fully landed. It's almost like because there was that lack of full welcome, I never fully landed. A part of me is floating in the spiritual world and hasn't fully shown up in my body, hasn't fully shown up in this humanness because I never felt welcomed. I never felt like I was called in. And what's powerful about identifying this is literally like the root seed of where some of these deep personality core wounds come from. And when we can identify it, we can actually start to differentiate. We can start to heal it because, of course, underneath, life wanted you here. You were so called in. There's totally a place here and there's a purpose. And there is going to be layers of grief of like, why weren't my parents more grounded and prepared? Why wasn't I brought in that way? And really helping ourselves differentiate between, oh, it's not that I'm disappointing. It's not that I'm, not welcome. It's that my parents weren't grounded and clear in themselves and ready to be able to welcome me from a mature place, a mature resource place. And that's very different than there being something wrong with us. And so, the cool thing we can do if we can become conscious of this is, mistakes happen. We can have all the consciousness in the world and get pregnant accidentally. But what's cool is if we have consciousness around it, we can still repair it. So, if we get pregnant accidentally and the first moment we look, we're like, oh God, what? And we have to go through a period of distress about that. We can come back and we can start to speak that to our child energetically in our womb. Hey, sweetie, wow, I didn't anticipate you were coming. And I love you. Like giving corrective healing statements. I love you. I am glad you're here. I'm so open to learning about why you showed up here. And this is where we need to lean into getting support to process the hurt about it and the distress about it, maybe even the frustration about it, like all the stuff. To process that with another adult, and then really coming in and doing a lot of corrective messaging to that little one in the womb of, yeah, I didn't plan to have you and you're here and I'm going to love you. I'm going to find my way to really learn about why you're here. And we can also correct that by now embodying a lot of welcome. But what we have to understand is for children that have that imprinting, they're going to need more welcome. They're going to need more affirmation of why you love them and why they're here. And the other thing is if you have children that are older, they are going to need you to be real with them at a certain point, at a developmentally appropriate point, for you to be real about how they came in and the feelings you were having. Because you being real about that in a loving, and here's the thing, you have to do it though in a way that's like, this is what came up for me, but now I love you. Like, and really I did love you and this is why I'm so glad you're here. And this is what came up for me, so that they can understand that they were just feeling your stuff when they came in and they don't walk around carrying it as something wrong with them. So the most disorienting thing for adults is when all of that was alive when they were conceived, but the parents keep telling them the story. We wanted you. We were so glad you were here. And we just celebrated when you arrived. But of course, they can feel something different inside. And so we need to be honest so that that can be felt through, that can be healed. If we lie, it's super disorienting and it'll just make the child feel even more lack of self-worth. There's something wrong with me. Because not only did I come into a field that gave me that message in a way, Also, now I'm being told that no, I was loved and welcomed. So what's wrong with me that I'm feeling like this? So we really want to be honest. The most ideal thing is when we can tell a really healthy, loving, welcoming story to a child about, wow, our daughter, she came out of nowhere. We weren't expecting her and she was a surprise. And we had to feel a lot about that. Because it was a surprise. And now we're like learning about the surprise gifts she brings, like telling an accurate story that doesn't go too deep into the pain point, but that child can work with. And, really reflecting on your own conception, your time in the womb where you experience these things will be really powerful too. And so, yeah, this is conception and preconception. This is the power of what those times bring. For those of you who are curious about the point of discovery, we can also repair with children around that. And, let's say you're a mom and you discover you're pregnant, you're so excited, but your partner's feeling a lot about it. And maybe they're disappointed, maybe they're upset. You can buffer children from that by really saying, Papa's having feelings right now. It's not about you. You can actually speak that to the child. It's not about you. This is about Papa's worry about money. This is Papa's worry about his own self-care. This isn't a reflection of you. And we're going to figure this out. And it's so magical that we can actually speak these things to our embryos, to our wombs, to these little beings in there. And it completely can rewrite how they orient to these moments, because suddenly it's not, oh, there's something wrong with me. Suddenly it's, oh, okay, yeah, parents have feelings. Shit happens, but it's not my fault. I'm not getting blamed. Oh, and the adults are dealing with it. Relief. Yeah. And, for me, I just want to speak to just to give another example of what a conception imprint can look like. And a discovery imprint is my parents wanted me. They had tried to have children, had several miscarriages. So when they had me, they were so excited. I was so welcome. The field was so ready. And I feel that inside. I have there's a baseline self-confidence that I have that quite a few people around me don't have, who didn't have that kind of field. And I know that it's from that time. I can feel it. It's like a sense of I was called in. It's a certain kind of self-worth that's unshakable. And I would say that that's a huge gift, because it's helped me throughout my life in all the other struggles I've had, because I can keep resting into that kind of core self-worth that's there. And we can all discover that. We can all rewire that in. But I just want to emphasize what that's like, to know that you're welcomed in that way. Now, the challenge to my conception was, in the discovery, my parents are both excited, but also afraid, right? Because they had these miscarriages. So I also have an imprint where there's an imprint in my field where it can feel like, and it has created an experience of people being worried there's something wrong with me, or perceiving a weakness in me when I'm not feeling it on the inside. So I'm not feeling struggle, but the outside is perceiving that there could be struggle. And that's because I was well, I was going to live, but my parents had a fear, a genuine fear. Now, what would have been helpful for me, and of course my parents didn't know to do this, would have been if they could have kept orienting me to that. Like we had other little ones in our womb and we lost them, and there's so much grief about that. And that's why we're feeling afraid. And this isn't about you. Like mama's feeling fear. It's not about you. There's nothing wrong with you. And I'm having this fear that's to do with the past. That would have helped me orient different. So that I wasn't, because instead what happened for me was I was thinking, well, there must be something wrong with me, because there's this constant feeling like I might die. So there must be something wrong with me, is the way that it landed in me and then played out in my life in so many ways, where I was walking around being like, could someone help me understand what's wrong with me? But it literally was just this constant gaze that was worried. That really impacted my journey. And there's been so much medicine, and it would have been a lighter load if that would have happened. And so, so these are just some examples. I invite you after this, get curious. What kinds of things, what are the stories? What were the emotions happening? Map it out. And what has blown my mind about this kind of work is, literally our life patterns are made up of our preconception, conception, time in the womb, and our birth. They shape most of the experiences that we have in this life. And so you can actually start to track all the ways this shows up. And another way that these conception imprints show up is in how we birth creations. So if we're wanting to start a project, if we're wanting to, start a new business, a new art piece, how we were conceived will deeply inform the process. And the parts of our conception that were really smooth and clear will help us be able to create in a really smooth and clear way. And the places where it was sticky is going to show up too. So for me, in my creative process, I have lots of clarity in what I want to birth, lots of belief that it has so much value. It's really easy for me to vision and bring into like the idea. And where I get stuck is thinking that other people are going to think that there's something weird about it or wrong with it. And that's from that imprint, right? And then there's so many other ways it got reinforced throughout my life. And so that's the edge I get to keep working with is, there's that feeling that the external gaze is going to think there's something wrong. There's that imprint again. And now I get to be like, this is from my conception. And just naming that for ourselves can be liberating. It can free us from the imprint itself, even when we can name that. This is from my conception. This actually has nothing to do with this moment at all. And it's just like, that's how strong it's in my physiology. And that in itself can be a beautiful practice, not to pathologize or to make it bad, not to like feed the problem, but just to name, it's like a healthy naming of this is where this comes from in my field. And I don't need to get so attached to that this is what's happening now. So liberating. So if any of you out there want to dive more into this work, this is work. I'm starting a Holy Mama membership in the new year where we're going to be working with layers of this. I also do this work in one-on-one when I do my year-long containers called Rebirth with people. We dive deeply into these kinds of imprints and it's transformational. It helps people step into their gifts more, their business more, their leadership more, their parenting, their partnerships in a more powerful way. It's core foundational work that's breathtaking. And then also, there's so many somatic therapists and resources out there there's even things that like through hypnosis and regression and the gene keys where we can go in and really work with those imprints. And so I encourage you to reach out and get support with that and to work with it. And thank you so much for tuning in. I'd love to hear what came up for you, how this was helpful. And also just want to speak to a call out to Mindful Meds who are sponsoring this podcast, and they have such a beautiful array of medicinal mushrooms. Some are psychoactive, some are not. And, I remember going to one of my friends' houses who has the whole kit because they have a whole kit you can get. And basically it's all these different mixtures of medicinal mushrooms that you can use for many different aspects of life. And I remember just feeling like, wow, how resourcing to be able to every morning. And she described her process every morning, waking up and deciding with letting her body decide, these are the mushrooms I'm going to bring in to support me. And I know for me in my preconception time, I used mushrooms, non-psychoactive mushrooms to build up my adaptogens, build up my body. And also in my postpartum time, I've had a lot of support from the mushrooms as well. Happy Days was a really big support, especially really postpartum. And I use it now whenever I'm feeling the call of the mushrooms. I'm just really encouraging you to bring them in as a support for reconnecting because the mushrooms have been found to be very helpful for reforming and opening neural synapses that are formed from those early times. So they can really help us in this rewiring. So thank you so much.